So this is from the saga of the Greenlanders, which is the saga of the Icelanders who go to Greenland. And it goes, Herjolfur var Bárðarson, Herjolf's son. Herjolf was the son of Bárð, the son of Herjolf. And that's exactly modern Icelandic. There's nothing changed there. Hann var frændi. He was a kinsman. And frændi is our word, English and Old Norse were very similar. And we have friend, and frændi is originally, your friend is your kinsman. Ingolfs, hann var frændi Ingolfs of Ingolf, landnámsmanns, a settler, a land-taking man. Still perfect modern Icelandic. Ingólfur gaf Herjolfi land. Ingólfur gave land to Herjolf. Á milli Vágs og Reykjanes. Á milli Vágs, which means between the place called Vág, which means bay, and Drepstokki, which is a farm site. Þorgerður, which is a perfect modern Icelandic name, there's many people named Þorgerður, hét kona hans, was the name of his wife. And that also, this is as accurate in modern Icelandic as it is in Old Norse. And Bjarni, which is a person, sonur þeirra, who was their son, og var efnilegur maður, and he was a promising young man. So if you were to write that in modern Icelandic, it'd be exactly the same.
All right, so today at Vikingology Podcast, we are delighted to welcome to the show somebody who needs no introduction when it comes to studying the Vikings. That is Jesse Byock, and he's coming to us from Los Angeles. And he is an archaeologist and historian and specialist in the Old Norse language, which was the language that was spoken by the Vikings. And he is also the author of many publications, many articles, many books, including a couple of my favorites here, Viking Age Iceland, and also his language series, How to Learn Old Norse, the Viking language. And we'll talk with him a little bit about that. But welcome. I should also say you're the director of the Mosfell Archaeology project, which we talked a little bit about in one of our previous episodes with David Zori, who worked with you. But we'll get into a little bit of that as well, because you spent a lot of time in Iceland working on that site. So
Yeah.
welcome.
Well, thank you. Thank you. Nice to be here. It's sort of fun doing this.
Yeah, good. Well, so I wanted to actually just start with kind of basics for your personal and professional journey, and just say, why Vikings and why Iceland?
You know what? When I was 13 years old, I had one of those summers and didn't know what to do as a kid. And I found in my father used to read a lot. He had a saga of the Volsungs by William Morris, who was written, in the 1870s and whatnot, so I read it and it hooked me. I loved it. And years later, found myself in Iceland. I was on the way to Europe, and back then the cheapest way to fly to Europe was Iceland Air. And so I thought I'd get off the plane and spend, a few days. And a year and a half later, I was herding sheep up on the northern fjords.
Oh, geez. We're back to sheep already, CJ.
Yeah.
We're talking about sheep.
Yeah. You mentioned sheep. I know a lot about sheep,
Maybe we should have called the show Sheepology.
Yeah, exactly.
All these experts on sheep.
The art and science of Viking sheep.
The sheep in Iceland are different from other kinds of sheep. Maybe that's what Sig was talking about.
Yeah, it is.
That they're long-haired sheep rather than furry little creatures, as you find in most other places.
Well, I mean, so little did you know at that point you'd be working on an excavation site for like 20 years in that country.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. And that's part of it. Always wanted to be an archaeologist, and so I had I lived in France for a while, and my father always wanted me to be a lawyer, so I ended up at the École de Droit, and then I was in Sweden, and I spent several years at the university there and doing Old Norse and archaeology. And anyway, ended up back in the States at universities, and at UCLA. I'm also a professor at the Kotzen Institute of Archaeology, and have been so for many, many years. And started an archaeological project in Iceland after spending a long time looking around for a site that I thought would really work with all that Iceland offered: sagas and seafaring and the culture of the land and the narrow valley and whatnot at Mosfell in near Reykjavik.
Well, so I'm going to share the screen and show a few little slides so we can kind of introduce some of these projects that you're talking about, and then we can dive in a little bit deeper on some of them. Although first I have to show this. Like, look at here's when I first met you.
Yeah.
That was
That's at UCLA.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, UCLA. That was 5 years ago at the what is it? The Society for the Advancement of Scandinavian Studies. I gave a paper there, and then David did as well. And then you had a big fete there for your retirement, right? At that time. So
Right.
that was fun to meet you. But so here is your website, oldnorse.org. So everyone can check this out, and we'll put a link to this in the description of the show. And you can go here and take a look at your various publications, but also learn how to speak Old Norse and the program that you have developed for that. So this is cool. And I love that shot. Did you take this photo?
No, I have a friend, Magnus Lyngdal,
Yeah.
who's a great photographer.
That's amazing.
And he took this, and he's got wonderful. These are all his shots, and he came over and gave it to me. And he works with me sometimes.
Nice.
And, yeah.
Yeah. So some people, some of our audience, maybe if you've been to Iceland or Reykjavik, you know that's the Sun Voyager sculpture that's very famous right there on the harbor and in downtown Reykjavik. Beautiful, beautiful. And then, so this is your latest translation that just became available or a couple months ago, right? So the Tale of...
Yeah, that's neat. This is a project I worked on for years at UCLA. Also, I'm a professor at the university in Iceland, and I would teach courses in Old Norse. And the question is how to actually teach the language. So I have come up with a series of texts. This is bilingual with vocabulary and notes and stuff like that. So yeah, just looking at it, I rather like
it. Nice.
This is a rune stone from Denmark, by the way.
Huh? Where? I'm going to Denmark.
This is a Yelling runestone.
I'm going to Yelling. I'm going to Yelling. Okay.
Oh yeah. They now have it in a glass case, and it's out there. Yeah.
Actually, you know what? I recognize this little symbol right here because when I talk about runes, it's actually on the Danish passport, the Yelling runestone, and then this little image right here in particular, it's down in the corner of the pages of the Danish passport even still. So I love that the modern Danes are still so embracing their Viking Age history.
Yeah, one of the things is, as you know, I've done these textbooks that one can do it differently, but and often they're done by people who are more interested in linguistics and whatnot. But the runes have usually been kept as a course for advanced graduate students and whatnot. But actually, the real language of the Viking is the runes. It's close as you're ever going to come to the speech of the Vikings.
Yeah.
And so I always teach that right at the start.
Nice. Yeah, actually, I have my students read the chapter in your book about the Danish runes when I introduce the runes. So, all right, let's see what next. Okay, so then, yeah, the Mosfell Archaeological Project in that beautiful valley that I also call home when I am there. I love it there so much. And this is the project that you worked on for about 20 years. And David Zori, our previous guest, was one of your grad students and worked with you. Was he co-directing with you on that site?
Yeah, well, he started out as a beginning graduate student with me, and then worked several years on this. And then I had a partner, Philip Walker, who was a professor at UC Santa Barbara, and Phil died, which was really a very sad thing. He was also, one of my best friends. And so David, by that time, had been with us for a while, and he became the field director, and then worked with me as a partner on this.
Yeah, nice.
And this and David really is terrific as an archaeologist. He really knows what he's doing. So the two of us have had a great time, and we're great friends.
Yeah, so we've got this farm here, right, at a place called Riesbru, and I'm just giving another slide here so we can get a sense of that. And so the main things that you were excavating, I've kind of got my arrows here. So this large mound here, and then the smaller area here. And then I'm going to show, there you go. So that's what you uncovered there, right?
Yeah. It's an amazing longhouse because all the stones and all the foundation structures are there, and it's almost surely the best documented longhouse. What's happened with a lot of longhouses in Scandinavia is that they were always made near the fields, but the plow, I don't know if you know about I'm sure you do, in fact, about in the Middle Ages, the plows changed, and they put a metal shear in front, so that it's called the plow zone, and that went much deeper, and most of the longhouses were buried, and the long plow went over them, so that we really have just post holes. But here, as you can see in this, all of the stone foundations, you can tell where the doors are, you can see the fireplace. Is a great project.
So how were you tipped off that this might be there?
That I used a saga, Egil saga, at the very end, speaks about how Egil Skallagrimsson, the warrior poet, who's the hero of this great saga, they said that he lived at this place in his old age, and he was buried there. And then there's always the controversy that goes on in Iceland that they're really literature, they're not history. So no one actually went out there as an archaeologist. And I went out there and talked to the farmer, who said, he was great. He said, well, he's not an educated man or anything like that, but he reads his saga. So I said, where do you think it is? And he said, oh, just behind the stable. It's called Kirkjuhóll, which means church knoll. So we went up there, and there was the church, and then later the longhouse. So it's either rural knowledge or maybe oral knowledge going back many centuries.
So you weren't necessarily trying to make the, do that. What's the cardinal sin of like historians and to make the evidence fit the thesis. So trying to make sure that the saga was true, or were you like just sort of digging and then sort of hoping for, whatever was to come, it was to come?
Well, one can debate what this is, but the saga names that this place was Hrísbrú. Now, the question is where you find it on Hrísbrú, which is a large farm.
Yeah.
So I just decided we would trust the saga. the question about archaeology is where you dig. You know, you can spend years putting holes in the ground and coming up with nothing. The real trick is to really find something. And you can miss something by less than a foot, and you have nothing. So I spent a long time looking for a valley, looking for a site, and a site that had some historical importance. If the saga is reporting some sort of accuracy, then this was a great chieftain's family, and that it would form part of the history of Iceland. Up to then, it hasn't. So we went out to Risbru, and here's a really high status, magnificent longhouse with the church that's mentioned in the saga, right at the site that's mentioned in the saga, with a graveyard, which is mixed Christian and pagan. And then there's a cremation site there. So it's got everything on the Viking Age, including it's in a defensive site on the side of a mountain, overlooking the coastal mouth of the valley, where the sagas also say there was a Viking Age harbor, and sure enough, it's there. So one has to decide what the value of trying to understand what the validity of the sagas is. My view on this whole thing is that sagas get very much into personal life. So you have men and women whispering to each other at night in bed. Well, you know, who knows what they really whisper to each other. But when they tell you something is at a place in a valley, surely the people in the 1200s understood what was there in the year 1000.
So did the modern Icelanders understand what was there? I'm thinking about.
No, you know, the farmer was sure it was there.
Okay.
And he told me that he and his father and his grandfather had tried to talk to every educated man. We had this wonderful conversation. He was in the tractor, and I went out in the field, and he stopped, and the tractor's going boom, 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 and he has a cigarette in his mouth, you know, and we're talking, and I'm yelling up to him. He didn't speak English, so we're speaking Icelandic, and he takes his cigarette out and he sort of points to me. He said, you know, my father and grandpa and all that. And he said, now you're here. I said, okay, let's go take a look. So we did. So and he and I became great friends.
And he just passed last summer, I think. Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah, my friends that I live with in the valley there, they all went to school with his kids. And so they all know each other there, as you know. And she was the one that mentioned to me last year that he had passed away. But
right, Ólafur was his name, Ólafur Ingimundarson.
Yeah.
And the fellow that you're talking about is Andreas.
Yeah.
Olafsson. You know how the Icelanders use the names.
The patronymic.
You know, so this became a really large excavation. It's rare to stay for archaeologists to stay in the same spot. And what we did is we are exploring an entire valley, and we, you know, ended up with permits for that, which is quite wonderful.
Yeah, one of the things that people can do on the website that I just showed, and we'll link that up as well, is, you know, you've got these great, you know, field reports for year by year going all the way back to the beginning in 1995. And so it's really cool to kind of follow the progression of it. But what was the first part? Like what like the first corner, the first stone, something where you're like, oh my God, it's here. What happened?
Well, the saga has this wonderful description of a burial, and it's a burial of Egill. And they say that you see, Egill was supposedly a great warrior poet, and you know, there's some people thought maybe he didn't exist because all you have is a saga. And they say that he was buried in the first. He dies. If you do some chronology, and these are always pretty well accepted in the Icelandic books, he supposedly died before Christianity, right before about 990, and the saga says, it's at the very end of the chapter, that he's buried in a pagan burial mound down in front of the farm at a place called Tjaldanes. And then about 10 years later, Iceland converts to Christianity. and the family at the Longhouse, which is a very prominent family. It's, very soon after, it's the law speaker of Iceland. His name is Grímur Svertingsson, and his wife is Þorgerður, who is Egil's stepdaughter. And supposedly Þorgerður, and the saga tells us, loved her stepfather greatly, and that's why he was living with them in old age. And she wanted him moved to this new conversion church because they'd converted Christianity and buried in the churchyard. So it tells us in the saga where he was. So that's when the idea came is, you know, if you're going to go look around, why not go to Hrísbrú? Why not go to place? And when the farmer told me that behind the stables, there's a mound called Kirkjuholt, church knoll, that sort of sealed the deal. Up on Church Knoll, I could see there were ruins, and the excavation began. So, but what we're doing is excavating this entire valley and trying to put the pieces together of Viking life. And there's probably no other valley in all of Scandinavia which is in pristine rural state, filled with Viking age remains. And up further in the valley, there are ship settings, these stone settings with ships that look like ships for burial. And then there's a place, all kinds of farm sites and high status, low status, and then the question of trade comes in, and connections, and the artifacts that we found. It's been fun.
That valley has just got to be like just full of stuff. I mean, it's just the proximity, the route to the Althing. I mean, just it's just got it. And when I went, David showed me or told me how to find the one ship stone setting that's out by the little iron stream, you know, as you walk not very far past Hrísbrú. And I took my friends there who literally grew up, you know, across the street, and they didn't know it was there. They didn't know anything about it. They thought it was super cool to see it. And I have to go back now. I've made it my mission. The damn Lupina is taking over everything there. And pretty soon that ship setting is not even going to be visible anymore if you don't know where it is. And so I'm going to go there and like pull out the stupid lupin flowers that are.
Yeah. You know, that was the extraordinary thing, is that the people in the valley knew about a few things, but actually, and they knew about the saga, but they didn't know about the sites. And the Icelandic Museum in the 1990s had done a survey, and they found a few places, but it was all really unknown. And the way we found the ship settings, which you know, really are a gem of archaeology, was that one of the farmers mentioned, after you're in a place for a while, either you get along with the people or you don't. We get along real well. They would have come to me and say, hey, you know, I saw something. So we'd get on a horse and go out there and go around, which is a lot of fun, you know. And some of my best friends are in the valley, and we do everything, like have horse races and stuff like that. But we go up there, and you have to get right on top of it to see the thing. Yeah. It's 30 meters long, 10 meters wide, 69 stones. And yet, as you say, the vegetation has covered it. So one of the things we did was clear the vegetation around it so that we could really understand it.
Yeah, that's the stuff that's still there, like the landscape paper or whatever that you know, the evidence of you guys having been there across the middle of it.
Yeah. That's where we did an excavation. You know, that cut that we did down the middle, we were hoping, first of all, Iceland, as you know, has had terrible erosion. That area has had a bad erosion. The valley itself is an unusual valley in that it's been a catch basin for soil, and that has preserved so much of the original Viking age period remains. And that too was one of the reasons that I chose Mosfell.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, okay, Ale Saga, I mean, it's part of this larger tradition of the Icelandic sagas. And I mean, it's always interesting to me, and maybe to CJ too, because he's a writer about the Vikings. But when you look at the stories, it's like, it just begs the question, what's the deal with Iceland? Because it's this small, remote place that's not urban, and yet it has this huge literary tradition and the production of those stories. And I mean, it's sort of like, why there of all places? Because historically, that's an unlikely candidate for such things, right? So why do you think that all of these things in this sort of saga tradition came out of there, of all places, in Scandinavia?
Well, there's something about frontiers and migration sites that what Iceland really is a transmarine migration of people west across the Atlantic. They leave mostly Norway or the Norwegian settlements in the British Isles, Orkney, Shetland, and Hebrides. And if you look at a map, and there's in some of those books I've done, I have maps, it goes out to Iceland, is that once the people got there, they discovered a rather interesting thing, that the ships that brought them out there, which are a product of the Viking Age, the wealth of the Viking Age, which comes from a lot from trade and a lot from plunder, allowed them to have the iron and the wood to put into these ships. The Viking Age ships cost a lot. And economics is really part of the history that we're interested in. Is there's over 300 kilos of iron in one of these ships. You know, they have nails holding the strakes of the sides together. And when they got to Iceland, Iceland is igneous, it's a volcanic area, different from the sedimentary rock of the Scandinavia. So the soil is different. It doesn't produce really the kind of either oak or pine that you have in mainland Scandinavia. So they didn't have ships. So you have a culture that moves from one place to another place, and they become, as far as their culture, extremely conservative in remembering what the history of their origins are. And Iceland, the other thing is that you mentioned it's little, it's not little at all. Iceland is an enormous place. It's 2/3 the size of England and Scotland together. It's 25% larger than Ireland. And it has a very small population, which became quite isolated. And although they're in contact with mainland Scandinavia, their culture turns inward. And they build on the culture that they brought with them and become very original in it.
Yeah, I think, well, maybe small, maybe not geographically, but at that time, I think from a standpoint of being urban or not, you know, they don't have big cities or anything like that. And typically you see, you know, deep, sophisticated literary traditions coming out of more urban places, right? I mean, more developed places.
Oh yeah, no, I agree with you totally. And I didn't mean to disagree about small. I mean, it's got a tiny population. That's the whole thing. I mean, you know, Ireland has millions of people, and if you take England, Scotland, 2/3 of it together, and Iceland probably had maybe 30, 40,000 people in the Middle Ages, in the Viking period. And they settled around the coast and in these fertile valleys, and then erosion sets in, and they maintained a culture in which they altered the culture that they brought from Scandinavia by really one tremendously important part, is that at the time that Scandinavia is moving from chieftains to paramount chieftains to kingship, the Icelanders made some sort of collective decision. It's really quite interesting. You know, most anthropological understanding of how cultures work is that at a certain level of social integration, you don't know what is to come next, because what happens is things happen and then you advance to another stage of complexity. But the Icelanders did something quite different. They came from where the complexity was already moving to kingship, and they made a culture in which they reserved the rights of all freemen not to become aristocrats and kings. And this worked for a while. So the chieftains that we have in Iceland, they're really very petty chieftains compared to the great warlords you have in Scandinavia. And they're more like local big men who need the farmers. So part of this is understanding their Viking Age origins. And they're very good at this. They tell these stories, and then they get written down. And of course, they're much better in when they were written down in literature. But the kernel of all these stories are true, and you can see the society. And what you really see is how much most farmers disliked their neighbors.
So is this, that old Bryce quote that I always tell my students too, right? They come up with this.
Yeah, I loved it. Yeah.
This complex system, and who would have thought, this amongst men whose chief occupation is to kill one another, right? So, I mean, it begs, I always tell my students, it's like, I think that it's a lovely level of self-awareness that they knew that, like, all right, let's not descend into violence because that's what we're prone to. So let's like try to get a handle on this. And, at least that's what it feels like to me, figure out how to live according to the law. But it does beg the question about the violence. And CJ, what was in our last podcast with Leszek, what was he saying about archaeology and violence?
Oh, he insinuated that through his research, looking at thousands and thousands of graves, that the evidence for the Viking Age being an age of violence is not true. That in the archaeological record, the evidence for that violence is non-existent practically. To which I push back a little, thinking, well, I think a warrior culture implies some degree of violence, right? Because the elite in your society are killers, essentially. So, but he said, in the graves, there's just not that evidence for the trauma one might expect from this being an age of violence, which I found really interesting. It was good food for thought, but I'm not entirely convinced, but then again, I haven't seen thousands of graves.
So what do you think about that, Jesse?
I love it. First of all, Leszek's a wonderful archaeologist, and he was going to be working with us at one time. You held up a book, Viking Age Iceland. What I'm really interested in is how the society worked. And if you're that far in the north, and you have to maintain a certain level of continuity and peace, because if you go around and burn down farmsteads all the time and kill everybody, you can't make it through the long, hard winter, where you store the food and whatnot. So there are all kinds of rules about how you deal with violence, and that's something that interests me. And I wrote a book on feud in the Icelandic saga, and I had this all worked out. However, the first two graves we uncovered at Mosfell, one guy has an axe chopped through his head, and a sword slice on the back of his head and whatnot. And there's a saga that talks about an attack on Mosfell by a rival chieftain, who's the two sons of the chieftain at Mosfell and this other guy had killed each other in a feud, and they kill each other there. And I don't want to disagree with Leszek, but I must tell you, I do think it was a violent place. And the thing is, if you study feuding societies, and this definitely was a feuding society, and wealth and status was often regulated by feud. There are rules to keep it within bounds, But you'll find in these societies that an awful lot of young men don't make it past 30.
Mm-hmm. And with our conversation with Peter Kuznitsky, am I saying that correctly? From medievalistbynet.net.
Konechny, yeah.
Konechny, there we go. Yeah. So I am not a linguist, but anyway, our conversation with him about how those rules broke down in the 13th century, leading to a crisis where the Icelanders had to invite rulership from Scandinavia, which is really interesting. So those rules didn't hold up over time either.
Yeah, Peter's he's he runs medievalist.net, this website, but he's also a historian, and he's interested, his main area is military history, and so he did it like a deep dive on the Sturlinga saga.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
so we did a podcast with him, and just sort of talking about how, this tenuous sort of order, that you're talking about with the, establishment of the Althing and everything, it lasts for what, about 300 years, it like starts to fall apart then, by the time you get to the 13th century.
Right. That's why, let me just go turn this phone off.
Okay.
Oh, it turned off. Okay. Yeah, I see it, that these rules broke down, and this level of all chieftains are by law just farmers, and a farmer is a bonti, and the plural, that's bændur. And in Norway, there are many levels of farmers, of bændur, and then minor chiefs, and then aristocrats, and then hersir, which are royal governors, and then kings and whatnot. So Iceland didn't have any of that. However, by when you get to the 13th century, this Icelandic rules of holding people down so that the level of small-scale chieftains breaks down, and then they have people who would like to become ultimately king of Iceland, and they become jarls. But underneath, there's this large social layer of farmers who eventually take over again, and they bring in the Norwegian crown to stop the Icelandic leaders from taking control. And they make an agreement with the king. And the king then can only go so far. And in many ways, it depends how you interpret history here. And we know a great deal about this, is that the Icelanders are far enough away from Norway that the king's power was not very strong. And Iceland, in many ways, returns to this level of farmers with small-scale chieftains.
Never did have a king.
Yeah. For a short period, there is a jarl who thought he was in control of Iceland for just a few years, and then the king pushes him aside.
So I want to go back just real quick. I did have something in when we were discussing why Iceland, of all places, was so interested in preserving their history and finding that, and then recording it in the sagas and so forth. And I do wonder, to your point, Jesse, about this being a migratory zone where people have gone, they've left their homes and gone to this new place, that Iceland isn't especially fertile, or, and they've lost their shipbuilding tradition. And just as somebody who's lived between two cultures and lived between two countries and moved around a lot, looking back at history has been a way for me to piece together my identity, where folks who are born and live in one singular country or place, like place is a really important part of our identity, and for the most part, right? So I wonder if that's if the idea of being migrants to this new place is essentially what motivated them to be so interested in their own history, to preserve some kind of piece of their identity over the long term, so that they wouldn't lose it, right? And so that these rules would persist to keep things organized. Just a thought.
No, that's absolutely true. And there's what they call the founder effect. The first settlers who came were the founders of the new society, and they brought with them structures from Norway. And yet there was one enormous difference, and you mentioned it, is the first thing is the wood, so they couldn't build ships. The Viking Age is a period of movement in Scandinavia. There are ships, there is trade, there is plunder. The main part of the population were farmers, and yet we know that they went a lot of places and they did a lot of things. The settlers who came as part of this culture with ships which are made from the Viking wealth of the Viking Age, in economic terms, it was capitalized. The migration was capitalized by the wealth of the Viking Age, whether it's trade or war. They get to Iceland, they're stuck on the island, and then they had to change their economy because the Icelanders, there's no growing season in Iceland. So the only thing you can grow is a little bit of barley. They grow hay for their livestock. They're a herding culture. And they, in many ways, went back to hunting and gathering along the coast. Fishing is hunting and gathering if you're close in the coast. And they would go look for birds' eggs and whatnot. So the wealth of the Viking Age, which got them to Iceland, disappeared in Iceland. And archaeologically, we find that we dig up longhouses and the people had food and they ate and they had, these small-scale chieftains and low-caste farmers and all that. But we find hardly any artifacts in Scandinavia. When you dig up these places, you find gold and all kinds of enormous things going back to the Merovingian period in France. In Iceland, the amount of silver that they have found you can hold in maybe 2 hands. So there's some beads and things like that. So Iceland was off the trade route because Iceland really didn't have anything that the real world out there in Europe wanted. Norway had all kinds, everything from walrus skins to feathers for down, comforters. They had tar, which was incredibly important from their forests and whatnot. And Iceland had some very low quality wool. So you have a culture that adopts to the environment, and that's something that has interested us as archaeologists and historians, is you have a culture that economically devolves.
And also in a sense that it stood still, right? Like it's where things kept moving in Norway, and through exchange, the society, culture, language start to change. Iceland didn't have that opportunity, which I think takes us to the next question that you're probably going to have when it comes to language. As far as Icelandic, my understanding is Icelandic is the most closely related modern language to the old Viking language, right?
Yeah, absolutely. There's the Manuscript Institute in Iceland, the Artna Magnaean, and one of the scholars there was on TV, and I was really interested in this. And he was saying that, well, if he was walking in downtown Reykjavik and he met a Viking from the 1100, the 11th century, he could understand him. And I said, whoa, that's a great statement. And modern Icelanders can read the sagas. A lot of the phrases have changed, but in these textbooks that I have done on language, one of the things is about when the computer age started, some very clever Icelanders made word frequency of the sagas, and they found out which words were most used and most common. And so I took the 246 word, I divided it into nouns, verbs, adjectives, and whatnot, 50 of each. So I get 246 of the most common words. And those are the ones we teach in the book. And it includes all of the the strong verbs and stuff like that. This is a wonderful way, because instead of some obscure word, you really focus on the language. And with those 246 words, you can almost read a saga. But the interesting thing about them is every single one of those words are still in modern Icelandic. Now, when you get up to the first 70 are things like and but and his and her and all that. Okay, they're not. But after that, you start getting into nouns. And it turns out the word for man is the same and whatnot. Then you get into things like king and sword, sverder and spjot and
Kunningur.
spear and all that sort of stuff. And okay, in a modern Icelander, car and television is, computer has replaced those, but there's still good words in Icelandic. Horse is still horse, and dog is still dog, and wife is still wife, and man, husband. So every single one of the 246 words that we teach in Old Norse is still a good word in Icelandic, and they still decline in the same way and work in the same way.
So with this Icelandic tradition, does that mean technically that Old Norse is not a dead language?
Yeah, you could say that. Yes. Yeah.
So unlike, because Latin, because like let's take Latin for example. Like we have no.
I know you like that, Terry.
we have no Latin speakers to draw upon for pronunciation. There were no Latin speakers for a very long time, other than people in the church who are reproducing it. So it is a dead language because nobody actually speaks it. So we can't actually know how it would have sounded. Versus, so I don't know if that's if because where we're getting these 246 words is from the sagas, and they are the same, but would the pronunciation be the same? Or do we know of any, like, how in English we had the great vowel shift, for example, which fundamentally changed how we speak in the middle of the kind of in the last 500 years. So is there any way to know if modern Icelandic has had any of those changes or shifts over time from any sorts of causes?
Well, the two things you mentioned, and they're both terrific. One is that in many ways, Iceland is like, let's say if there were some island lost in the middle of the Mediterranean that we just discovered a few years ago, that was still speaking classical age Latin. Iceland might fit into that category, so that would be great. The other thing is that the consonants are absolutely the same. The vowels have changed a little bit. So instead of ah, you say ah and whatnot. And very little change there. Now, if somebody spends their life as a scholar studying the linguistics of it, they think the changes are very great. The ah and ah is an enormous, and there's a shift and all that. Again, go back to the fellow from the Arten Magnaean Manuscript Institute, who's one of those linguist types. I mean, everybody realizes, sure, you can understand each other. In other words, the word for mother, that means man. In the Viking times, it was mother.
Yeah.
Not a big difference.
Or is it that they've got what the U in front of the R instead of just the R at the end of the word?
Yeah, the spelling is different. The thing is, back then they didn't spell. And you know what? And Terry, you know a lot, so that it may be hard for the people listening to this, but you spell mother M-A and this strange D, eth, R in Old Norse, and in modern Icelandic it's M-A, eth, U-R. But I don't know how anybody in the earlier period actually pronounced it without a vowel. So I think I mean, you're going to be mater. So everybody said mother anyway. So the modern spelling has just taken into consideration the need for a vowel there. So spelling conventions, don't always reflect precisely the language.
So a couple of years ago when I was there, I was lucky enough, the Icelandic government, bless their hearts, let me in during COVID. And so I was there that summer and I wrote a piece about Iceland's medieval past with the Viking Age and the different aspects of Viking Age culture that exist now that to me seems like holdovers from that time so long ago. Different ways that they act with each other. Hospitality is very important for modern Icelanders. And it makes me think of like the hospitality with chieftains and things. But one of the things was the language and the linguistic part of it. And so I wrote a little part of the article about the Icelandic naming commission or committee, right?
Oh yeah, that's great.
This is the thing that it's very difficult for modern Americans to understand, but it's this idea of, a part of the government, the national government that needs to approve the name that you're going to name your child, if it's a name other than a traditional Icelandic name or that can be used with the Icelandic alphabet or spelled with the Icelandic alphabet. And I think of it as this kind of cool way of, them trying to preserve culture. And yet, modern Americans are horrified at the idea of the government being able to tell them what they can and can't name their kid, and so, I just think it's kind of a cool thing. What do you think about the fact that they have that?
I think it's great. And countries can do whatever they want, and people can have their culture, and there's some people who want no change and people who want change and some that don't want to. I sort of ran into that, as you know, I'm an Icelander now these days, and when they wanted to change my name, and my father's name was Lester, so they wanted to name it Lestrason. And so I would have ended up something like Ragnar Lestrason, and I just didn't like to do it, so I kept my name. So, well, okay.
You can't have the dual.
I could see going through the passport, in the United States, and having two names and going directly to jail. So I decided it was not a good idea.
Why won't they let you have dual citizenship with that? Why would they want you to change your name? That seems kind of strange.
Well, that was, and it was the law and that they changed it rather recently. I think it's like 15 years ago it was changed.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Well, probably they recognize that it is special that Iceland's so isolated that they've preserved this language for much longer than other languages or other countries, right? And through globalization and free exchange and opening up to the world, there is something to be lost, because through that exchange, language changes. And so then what they've preserved for the last 1,000 years could very quickly turn into something new, and then you would lose. And then the Old Norse would certainly become a dead language by that. By that transition, right?
Well, I don't know, I agree with that, but as far as names go, there's been a large immigration to Iceland now. There's a very large Polish population and stuff like that, and they have their names and what, and all their children learn Icelandic, and there are a lot of Vietnamese that have come and stuff like that. But they retain their names, and that's part of their culture. And I don't think the two actually conflict with each other. No one seems to have any trouble with my name. It even declines. Most people call me Jessa and Yessa and Yessa, and it changes. So anyway, it works.
What do they do with your name, Terry? Just Terry?
Well, just Terry, but because they roll the R's. So it's Teddy. Yeah, so me sounds like Teddy, like Teddy instead of.
Oh,
they say Teddy. Yeah. They don't say Terry and then Terra, Terra.
Yeah, like that to roll the R. Yeah.
What would they do with my name? Christoph.
Oh, Christopher. That's a good name.
And then you get the good hard R at the end, or Christopher.
It had occurred to me that I was looking over these textbooks in the morning, that I might read a little bit of Old Norse and give a little flavor to what it was, and since we're talking about the difference, and point out what is the difference between Old Norse and Modern Norse and that.
Yeah, if you have a couple of passages, that would be great.
Let me see if I think I had one of the books here. Hang on. Let's see. Okay, so this is Viking language. This is just in the first chapter.
These books are great too. I highly recommend them as a historian. It's not just a language book about learning language, but you provide a really cool like historical context at the beginning of each chapter. So they sort of double as history books as well.
Yeah. Oh, actually, I just opened it up, so I thought I would show. There's a wonderful map. Can you see this of the the sailing routes to Iceland, which are still the sailing routes? Okay, so this is from the saga of the Greenlanders, which is the saga of the Icelanders who go to Greenland, and it goes Herjolfur var Bárðarson, Herjolf's son. Herjolf was the son of Bárð, the son of Herjolf. And that's exactly modern Icelandic. There's nothing changed there. Hann var frændi. He was a kinsman. And frændi is our word, English and Old Norse were very similar. And we have friend, and frændi is originally, your friend is your kinsman. Ingolfs, hann var frændi Ingolfs of Ingolf, landnámsmanns, a settler, a land-taking man. Still perfect modern Icelandic. Ingolfur gaf Herjolfi land. Ingolfur gave land to Herjolf. Á milli Vágs og Reykjanes. Á milli Vágs, which means between the place called Vág, which means bay, and Drepstokki, which is a farm site. Þorgerður, which is a perfect modern Icelandic name, there's many people named Þorgerður, hét kona hans, was the name of his wife. And that also, this is as accurate in modern Icelandic as it is in Old Norse. And Bjarni, which is a person, sonur þeirra, who was their son, og var efnilegur maður, and he was a promising young man. So if you were to write that in modern Icelandic, it'd be exactly the same.
What do your students tell you that come to you to learn Old Norse? I mean, other than maybe wanting to be, a scholar in the language or something. I mean, why are people drawn to this language?
Oh, you know what? It's really interesting. I live in Iceland, and so I was back at UCLA, and they wanted me to give a course in Old Norse. So I did, and without even advertising it, it was just right last minute. 12 people showed up, and 3 were Chinese, and people just sort of are interested in it. It's known to be an interesting language, and then there's people like I asked them. I said, "What are you doing here? What this is supposedly obscure." And turns out it's not obscure at all. I mean, it's far more than people show up for the modern Scandinavian languages. Vikings, history, language, interest.
That's a nice equation, right? That's a good math equation right there. I mean,
Yeah.
that right? CJ and I have talked about this. I mean, it'll always be part of the backdrop of this podcast because we're about the Viking Age, and it's like, what on earth is the interest in Vikings? It is perpetual and deep, and it doesn't seem to die off at all. People just really like them.
Yeah. Strange.
I mean,
It's
actually,
interesting.
Go ahead, CJ.
I was just gonna say, yeah, since we had that discussion and on the topic of the popularity of the Vikings, I am doing a deep dive on the ancient Celts just for giggles, because first of all, it pertains to the writing that I do, but also it's just fascinating topic alongside the Vikings. And through that, I'm reading a book right now. I can't remember the title or the author, which is probably not good, but I'm reading through about the ancient Celts, and in the starting about the 17th and 18th centuries, there was a major interest in Europe toward the ancient Celts. And part of this book is putting into question whether the word Celt and the idea of the Celts is even valid, because a lot of it is just fictitious, because of the Romans, the Greeks, etc. Like it's a pretty complicated premise, but a lot of the things that made the Celts interesting, like feuding and feasting, and are things that are applied to. So I think there's just a human interest in these more primitive cultures that have these social bonds, social institutions, almost, if you will, surrounding, that the Vikings really embody the best of any historical population that we have, whether justified or not, because there's so much mythology that's cropped up around them. But yeah, I just thought it was interesting. I was listening to, what made the Celts popular back in the 18th and 19th centuries, and I was like, those are all the exact same things we were talking about for the Vikings. So this is not, it's the Vikings being popular isn't new. Cultures will just, each different era of modernity, if you want to call it, kind of picks and chooses who their favorites are, and Vikings just happen to be the popular thing du jour, which unfortunately kind of ties into, I remember back in 2011, I just finished my first manuscript, and we went to this movie. I don't even remember what movie, but the big popular thing back then was vampires. And I remember looking at my ex-wife at the time, and I was just like, Vikings are next. They're going to be popular next. And wouldn't you know it?
2013, the History Channel launches that TV show, and boom.
I know, 12 years later, and we're still doing it. So.
Yes, I had that. And I've told CJ this before too. I mean, I've been teaching Viking history here at a local community college since 2015, but it's a class I created from thin air because I'm a medievalist historian by training, and Northern Europe in particular. And I knew the Vikings were interesting, and my own Scandinavian background and everything. And, I tried to propose this class to be added as a brand new class, and I ran into quite a bit of resistance from administration. They just thought it was an upper division topic, and not suited to a community college audience, and they just thought it was obscure and just didn't understand it. And I fought that tooth and nail and got that class into the catalog, and lo and behold, this class is like the first class to fill up every single term, right? I mean, it's just insane, the interest in Vikings. It just keeps going. So I mean, and actually for me, probably maybe last question for me is, in a broader sense, it does beg the question of, where we've been talking a lot about Iceland, of course, because that's your area that you've spent the most time and stuff, but just, the Vikings in general across Scandinavia, are they special? For the context of the period of time in which they lived, are they unique?
I'll tell you, the Vikings had one thing, and this is now all Scandinavia and whatnot, and is that they had ships. And other people had ships also very quickly after, but they were the first to actually put it all together, to put the what they call clinker built, which I know you know about, of course, which is that instead of putting the side boards of a ship, which are called strakes, one on top of each other with ribs, and make like a Mediterranean ship, which is a very strong, and it doesn't give they're called strakes, overlap, and then you have these nails through that so that the Viking ship bends as it goes over, and they put the sail on top, and that comes around 750. And that's when the Viking age really begins. So the Vikings militarily didn't have anything special. They had the ship for surprise. They had the ship to allow them to go widely in the world, all the way from the North American continent down through the Mediterranean into the Caspian Sea and whatnot, down rivers. That is what made the Vikings, and the element of surprise that comes with ships. So, and then being able to transport armies. One of the great things is no matter how many Viking raids you have, we don't have any information on England attacking until later, when you have a Viking king in England. So the continent doesn't really go back and attack with ships. The Vikings use their ships. That's, to me at least, that's their originality. I mean, when you think, you think about in the Baltic, Sweden especially goes down the rivers of Russia, and they go down Volga and the Dnieper and whatnot. They go through the Black Sea, they get to Constantinople, then they're in the Mediterranean. They go down the Volga and they come to the Caspian Sea, and they go out the Silk Route, gets down to the Arab lands. It's the ships that allow them to do this sort of thing.
Right, that shallow draft that allowed them to go up river systems. Yeah, somewhere along the way, they figured out how to put down a keel, which gave them bigger sails, because there's a 7th century iteration of the longship that had a sail, it was just too small to make it ocean going.
Right, there's a certain minute, a minute when somebody says, that's it, and that changed everything. Then the navigational skills begin.
Right, it gave them access to the whole world, and they had the type of culture that made them inherently expansionist as well. I mean, even before they figured out how to put the keel down and have a bigger sail, we have evidence that Gotlanders were going to the eastern shores of the Baltic, right? So kind of what's now Estonia, Latvia. So they were already moving. It's just the ship gave them the ability to move faster, more efficiently, and also to come back, because their ancestors left and then didn't come back, right?
Yeah.
Well, it's funny that the ship. Let's see if I can pull it up here. Terry, you're reading this. This is the first book in my series.
I just started last night.
Yeah, tell us about this.
Yeah, so it's The Lords of the Wind is the first in the series. There's 3 now. It's about the Viking Hasting. I use the French spelling Hasting because the book's translated in French, and I don't know, I'm French, so I just use that. Plus, the people who wrote it down, they wrote it down in like 12 different ways, so I thought Hasting would be as good of a spelling as any of the others. But in the second chapter is when he first ends up on a ship. He's about 12 years old, and his ship captain, a man named Aleph, is actually, I love the name of the ship too, Sail Horse, which is a lot of fun. But when he's teaching him how to sail, and I remember, so where I got the inspiration for this was when I was a kid, my grandfather, was like, here's how you sail. And the first thing he did was teach me how to tie knots. And I was notoriously terrible at it. And so my character, of course, is notoriously terrible at it. So he's fiddling with ropes. And then Aleph tells him how important it is. He says, quote, a true Viking is a seafarer first and a warrior second. His strength is his ship, not his sword or axe. And so it's the emphasis on, you need to know how to use this, because this is your life, right? Because and we know from the early raids, they weren't particularly vicious, or I mean, they were vicious, but they weren't particularly effective warriors, right? If they came across an actual organized, say, Frankish army, it was game over for them. So they just, but what the ships allowed them to do was to just pack up and leave very quickly, right? There's the 2 Lives of Charlemagne, that lovely passage where Charlemagne's somewhere in southwestern France, and we're not sure if this is a real story or not, but it's still, it demonstrates an awareness the Franks had for this phenomenon where Vikings went to attack this town. Charlemagne happened to be there. As soon as they figured this out, they turned tail and ran, and Charlemagne sent ships after them, but they just couldn't keep up, right? And they just vanished. But then that's when Charlemagne does that dramatic, I love the scene where he does the dramatic looking out the window, I'm sick at heart. Like the whole, I'm sick at heart as to what these savages are going to do to my children. He was like, I'm not afraid for me, I kick their butts, but my children, and his children did end up being rather incompetent as in regards to the Vikings.
They began their incompetence just at the time the Vikings are ramping up being Vikings and really really hammering those people.
They were paying attention. Yeah. Sorry, was that Jesse?
I'm sorry. I was just going to add that, Charlemagne was very effective with the coast. He had squadrons of cavalry all along the coast that could rapidly react to the Vikings, and he had ships and stuff like that, coastal ships and whatnot. So, and yeah, you're absolutely right on that.
Yeah, they were lying in wait, right? They were kind of hitting the coast for a while. Well, that's why I just put out that article that just a summary of all my thoughts on all this idea of the connection with salt, and was it a motivating factor for the Vikings to go all the way to France so early in the Viking Age, right? The so-called Viking Age, which is when we read the historical raids: 793 Lindisfarne, 795 Iona, 799 Noirmoutier, right? Saint-Philbert off the coast of France. Like, why'd they go that far right away? So it's kind of this question that I've been looking to answer for a long time, but part of that is they really hung around just the coastlines for the first 30 years, and the second there was a rebellion within the Carolingian Empire, they went inland like right away. And so they knew, like, it's almost like they were just kind of like birds circling over a dying animal.
Yeah.
Right, and they're like, it's just a matter of time,
Waiting for any sign of weakness to exploit.
yeah, and they were there and they were going there frequently. Like, we know from the island, from the monastery of Saint-Philbert, they wrote about the quote unquote frequent and persistent raids. While redundant, it tells us just and that was 819, right? Just them getting attacked every single spring and summer. So the Vikings were there. They were very present as the Carolingians were essentially falling apart. And what's fun about my character that I have in the books, Hasting, he shows up in the Annals of St. Bertin in like 857 to broker a deal between the Bretons and the Franks, right? And it's like, so now he's a diplomat. Like, they got very involved in everything. So it is fascinating how they really went around and just were very intelligent about how they approached each different territory that they went to, and played this astute game of politics to really maximize the benefit to them.
Opportunism. This is what we did, right?
Yeah, that's it. I think that really sums up opportunity is where the Vikings, and also you should remember they were also traders. The same guys who would, if you were asleep, might kill you, were prepared to trade if the guards were ready and whatnot, and they would sail in and trade. And also, one has to remember that the Viking Age, and I think you, Adrian, you hit on it, is that the different regions often saw an advantage in the Vikings pillaging and plundering their opponents.
Yeah. What is that line? Better the what? The friend of my enemy is my, or no, what is that?
Yeah, I mean, you can imagine one feudal lord who hates the next feudal lord getting news that the Vikings have just burned his village or whatever down to the ground, and thinking, that's a nice opportunity.
Yeah. Oh, the timing was right. So I'm working on book 4 of this series. I'm actually going to make it book 1 of a new series, but it takes place in 847, which is when the Bretons actually formally declare themselves independent from the Frankish Empire. And the second they do that, boom, Vikings show up and win 3 successive battles, and then demand a Danegeld, right? So they were there, and they knew, right? Like, oh, you guys are weak now, we're coming to get you.
Well, and they'd already achieved Paris, right, in 845. So it's like, let's just keep rolling.
Let's just keep going with it.
Well, so Jess, when are you going back to Iceland?
I was planning to go back in May.
Okay.
We're thinking of doing something this summer, so we'll see what's going on. I ended up, I was supposed to be there this winter, and I'm still a professor at the university in Iceland, but I started teaching a course in archaeology here at UCLA again. So
oh, nice.
Yeah, it was fun.
Well, so I mean, we've got about an hour in, and so I want to be respectful of your time. But like I mentioned at the beginning, we'll post everything in the description of the show here, so people can check out your website and your books. And the map site if they want to see what's going on there with the excavations in Iceland. But is there anything else you want to like share or anything before we kind of wrap it up?
No, I think that's it. Love bringing people to the website, and, the archaeology is my joy. So, yeah.
Nice. Well, hopefully someday I'll be in Iceland the same time you are.
Yeah, that'd be great. That'd be great. And are you planning to be there this summer and whatnot?
I'm not sure if this summer because we're going to Denmark, but I'll probably go back, I don't know, maybe in the fall. I mean, I go every year, and I was just there, well, because we were talking on the phone when I was there, so I was just there in March, but we'll see. I have to think about that timing wise.
What are you going to do in Denmark?
Well, so my husband and I have an 80-acre Christmas tree farm, and he's big in that. And Denmark is a huge Christmas tree growing region for Europe, and they have a very, very large growers conference in the middle of August. So we're going to a Christmas tree growers conference in just outside of Odense, and then which David's excited about, right? Because he's like, that's my hometown. And then I haven't been to Denmark yet, so then we're going to go and see a bunch of, so we'll go out to Jelling. I want to go up to Lindholm-Husum and see the ship settings.
Oh yeah, that's great. That's great.
And
I excavated around there once.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, up on the tip there.
And I'll go to Roskilde and see the ship museum and stuff. And so, yeah, just get my Viking on over there.
Right. David speaks a dialect, Fønska.
Yeah.
And he's great at it. It really is terrific.
Yeah.
There's the island of Føn.
Yeah, so exactly.
That's where,
yeah, that's where the conference is actually. So we'll be out there as well. But anyway, but thank you so much for coming. This has just been a real joy.
Yes. Thank you.
Yeah, it was fun. And nice to meet you, Adrian.
That's great. Great chat and really interesting discussion. Just to reiterate for everybody, I am perusing the site right now. So all the books to learn Old Norse are at oldnorse.org. Yeah. Oldnorse.org. I don't think we said that before, but it's got everything on here.
I'd appreciate. Yeah, that'd be great.
And I think that's a great resource for those interested in picking up the language of the Vikings.
Yeah. Speak like a Viking. That sounds like a cool thing to do. All right. Well, everybody have a good day.
See you guys.
Thanks, Jesse.
Bye-bye.
Yelpst.